So this week marks the 1-year anniversary of the pandemic lockdown around the globe. We began this lockdown with a massive collective grief over the wildfires in Australia. And since then, we've experienced so much, including well over 500,000 Americans dying of COVID-19. To quote Stephen Colbert, I can remember exactly where I was when they first declared the global pandemic because I'm still here. For my part, I bought the book, The Magical Art of Tidying Up by Marie Kondo, and I proceeded to take it step by step. But now I'm back to where I was. We baked bread and dealt with the aftermath. We incubated eggs and dealt with the result, and they got big. We sat in the dark. We got out the vote. And I'm left with a question. It's most certainly been a wild year, but I don't have the answers for the pandemic or for climate or for the injustice of systemic racism that came to the fore. No, I'm hunkered down at home. I'm tired of Zoom, and I'm longing to hug my grandchildren, who are amazing, by the way. I, as many of you, are disconnected from loved ones and feeling pretty sad about it, actually, and perhaps a bit tender and open. For me to be too strident or certain right now could dishonor this sacred time that we travel together, and I'm not certain about anything right now, except one thing, and that is Marie Kondo is a revolutionary. Teilhard's words, someday after mastering the winds, waves, tides, and gravity, we shall harness the energy of love. And for the second time in the history of the world, man will have discovered fire. Teilhard's metaphor of fire as love and vice versa is a typical one. It's even cliche for us now. And for us here in California, obviously, fire can be a troubling metaphor, even as it's overused. And there are a few problematic words in Teilhard's quote. Words like mastering, harness, man, and even the word discovered. When I was 10 years old, I learned how to make a campfire. I learned that you start with a few wood shavings or leaves, the tinder, and on that you carefully layer small twigs, the kindling, careful to leave plenty of space for air to move around. And on those I would layer even larger twigs and then sticks. I learned that fire needs three things. It needs fuel, it needs air, and it needs a spark or heat. Absent any one of these things, and the fire wouldn't start, or it would go out. It needed all three. Now, that little 10-year-old might think she discovered and then harnessed or even mastered fire, when in fact you know and I know that she did not. The wind picks up, the fuel is available, the spark lands on fuel, and whoosh, fire could take off. But let's look at these three things. Let's start with the fuel. At age 19, I spent 2 summers as a firefighter on hand crews and in the Lassen National Forest. Nearly 40 years before the Valley Fire scorched Lake County, I witnessed up front and personal the destructive power of fire. Fires could get large, but none were even close to the scale of what we see today. We still held the illusion back then that we could fight them and stop them. We have yet to make peace with fire in the landscape. But it wasn't always so. California's original peoples understood the importance of fire to the health of the land. The land evolved with fire, and they tended to it, participating in a reciprocal relationship with the forest ecosystem. They knew that too much fuel would turn a life-giving fire into a destructive one. As recently as the 50s, they lit fires to burn away the brush and keep the forest healthy, until government officials, in all of their modern sensibilities, stopped them. Those officials mistakenly and unwittingly created the conditions for catastrophic megafires. They thought prevention was about preventing the spark, misunderstanding the whole relationship, until nature turned it up a notch with fuel and air. Today, we live with the tragic consequences of what this profound misunderstanding of the relationship was. Humans did not discover fire, not for the first time nor the second, I imagine. Fire existed long before it was discovered. Still, there's something primal in the Celtic indigenous roots of my ancestors. To them, the hearth fire represented a massive leap forward in the human condition. The hearth fire represents warmth, a good meal. It represents belonging. It represents love. In this way, fire is a gift to humanity. And what about air? I enjoyed fresh air as a child. With the forest so close to our home as a 10-year-old, my days were spent outside. I wandered that stretch of forest all the way from our home on Worrell Drive to the back lot of what was then called Merit Mart in Washington. Along the way, near the top of a hill, was a large rock, an exposed chunk of gray sandstone, and embedded in that sandstone were seashells. On a hill, I sat atop that rock drinking in the sunlight, and the rock told me the story of the seas that had once covered this land. Even that hilltop, was the hill pushed up, or did the sea level drop to create such a curious thing? As I closed my eyes and felt the breeze and the warm sun on my face, I marveled at how ancient time created all sorts of mysteries. This to me was my moment of grace, one that informs my life to this day, a love for deep time and nature. Thomas Berry, cultural historian and modern mystic, also shares his meadow moment, a time when he was 12 years old. His family had moved to the edge of town near a creek. Across the creek was a meadow, and of it he writes, "The field was covered with lilies rising above the thick grass, a magic moment. This experience gave to my life something, I know not what, but it seems to explain my life at a more profound level than almost any experience I can remember. It was not just the lilies, it was the singing of the crickets and the woodlands in the distance and the clouds in an otherwise clear sky." Do you remember your own meadow moment, your own moment of grace? The spaciousness of air gives us that. But what about the spark? My 10th year of life was a pivotal one. It's possible that our neighborhood was built near an old vernal pool. Whatever the cause, there were hundreds of frogs hopping about in our yard and all over the forest, all waiting to be discovered during my outdoor adventures. They were easy enough to catch and hold. They felt cool and moist and yet playfully alive in my hands. They could hop what seemed to be hundreds of lengths of their little green bodies. To me, they represented life, nature, and whimsy. And then I heard my sister shouting, "No, no, no." I ran toward the commotion in our front yard only to see my dad with a manual push lawnmower, sharp blades spinning in a whir of certain frog death. Frogs leaping left and right, the bodies of some who had not made it left behind in the wake of these glistening blades. What would love do? Well, love might plant herself right in front of that lawnmower. This was my first act of environmental activism. It was no small feat. My dad, an ex-Marine with a temper, would not tolerate me doing such a thing. I faced possible punishment. Of course, he could have physically moved me out from in front of that lawnmower. He did not. I stood my ground. Something in my resolve, or maybe his own love for frogs or his love for me, led him to compromise that day. Between my sister's screams and me planting myself in defiance, we convinced my dad to halt the carnage. For the next hour, my sister and I crawled through the long grass of our front yard, collecting frogs and placing them in a jar, knowing that any we missed faced execution from those unforgiving blades. After we were certain we had found them all, my father finished mowing. We then returned the frogs to the yard and volunteered for future frog patrol should he ever take it upon himself to mow again. We held a little frog funeral for the frogs that didn't make it. Even now, I wonder if I belong in such a world where humans could destroy such beautiful creatures. What kind of human existence makes it possible to mow a lawn where frogs live? Don't frogs have as much right to be there as we? And was a lawn really that important? Is this what Teilhard meant when he spoke of harnessing the energy of love, standing up to the powerful, to love something or someone so much that you could set aside fear and take a stand? Perhaps the air of time and space to be allows us to remember such moments. But what about the spark? It occurs to me that the spark isn't up to us. The spark emerges from somewhere else. This spark of life, this spark of joy, it's a gift. It's grace. To hear it, we must prepare the conditions to receive it, to listen as we sit in this sacred place. And that's where Marie Kondo comes in. She asked the question that to my adult self, what sparks joy? So I'll ask you, what sparks joy? If you don't know, perhaps spend time with your 10-year-old and listen. I admit, I've not always protected my 10-year-old, so sometimes she's shy and quiet, but other times she plants herself right there in front of the lawnmower. But given the time and space, I hear her more clearly. I recall the moments in the woods near Bremerton, Washington, where I fell in love with nature. When I'm at my best, this part of myself channels something important. She says, don't give up now. The dolphins will swim close to the cities. Animals will return if we let them. Frogs are worth more than lawns. She helps me answer the question, what would love do? And importantly, what sparks joy?